They had braced for chains, hunger, and humiliation, but when steaming mugs of fresh coffee and slabs of golden butter were set before them, the captured German women stared in stunned silence, wondering if captivity in America was punishment or temptation. German women auxiliaries, nurses, and clerks swept up in the Allied advance, their terror of they had been taught to fear capture more than death. In the Reich's endless stream of propaganda posters and whispered warnings, the Americans were painted as savages, men who would strip women bare, mock their dignity, and leave them starving in cages. So when the thunder of Allied tanks rolled through shattered towns and villages, when the front collapsed and the order to retreat came too late, the German women knew what it meant. There was no retreat for them. Nurses in grey uniforms who had once bandaged broken soldiers, radio clerks who had copied coded messages in neat handwriting, auxiliaries who had joined the war out of duty or desperation, all were swept up in the advance, driven into the custody of an enemy they had never seen but had been told to hate. The moment of capture carried no ceremony, no drama of a battlefield surrender. It came with the blunt reality of exhaustion. Some raised their hands before being asked. Others stood stiff, gripping their satchels, refusing to cry. A few had smeared dirt on their faces, hoping to look older, plainer, less noticeable. The youngest looked like schoolgirls dragged into a war they had never fully understood. What surprised them most was the absence of cruelty. The Americans shouted commands, rifles raised, but their eyes were not filled with the malice the Reich had promised. They were young men, tired, sunburned, carrying cigarettes between their teeth as they waved the women toward waiting trucks. One German typist clutched her crucifix so tightly it left a mark in her palm. She had been told this was the end of her womanhood, that capture was worse than death. Yet the soldier who frisked her did so hurriedly, almost awkwardly. When he found nothing, he simply pointed her forward without a word. The trucks rolled on, bouncing through ruined streets where walls leaned drunkenly against each other, the air still heavy with the smell of smoke and plaster dust. The women sat together in silence, skirts dirty, hair unpinned, each of them bracing for what would come next. Some whispered to one another in disbelief, "Why haven't they hurt us? Why haven't they mocked us?" But others shook their heads, convinced that the real cruelty would begin once they were hidden away from watching eyes. When night fell, the convoy stopped in a field. Guards posted sentries and passed around canteens. One of them held out water to the women who hesitated, certain it was a trick. The first drink tasted nothing but warm metal and salt. She drank again, then burst into tears. Around her, others finally lifted canteens to their lips. It was not mercy, not yet. They still expected hunger, still feared humiliation. But as the stars stretched over them and the guards leaned back against their trucks with a kind of weary indifference, a strange thought slipped into their minds. If this was captivity, it was already nothing like what they had been told. And that dissonance was scarier than cruelty itself. The journey west began in jolts and whispers, a procession of trucks rattling through ruined towns where windows gaped like hollow eyes, and chimneys rose from rubble like gravestones. The women sat crowded on wooden benches, uniforms and dresses coated in dust, hands clutched around small bundles of belongings. They had expected punishment, a beating, perhaps even to be paraded before jeering crowds. Instead, the Americans drove with grim efficiency, their attention fixed on the road, as though transporting prisoners was a task no more remarkable than hauling crates of supplies. At every stop, rumors spread like wildfire. Some swore they were being sent to Siberia, traded to the Russians where no one returned alive. Others whispered about salt mines or endless labor camps, where women worked until their hands bled and their lungs filled with dust. "They will scatter us across the world so Germany will never rise again," one girl muttered, staring at her knees. The older women shook their heads, unwilling to speak, unwilling to give voice to their fear. When the trucks reached the rail lines, the women were herded into freight cars. The slam of iron doors echoed like a verdict. Darkness pressed in, broken only by cracks of light through the wooden slats. The train groaned forward, carrying them through the scarred belly of Europe. They glimpsed flashes of devastation between the boards. Villages flattened, bridges twisted and broken, fields cratered and abandoned. It was the continent they had known, stripped bare and skeletal. Days blurred. The air inside the cars grew sour, heavy with sweat and fear. Some sang quietly to steady their voices. Others wept into their sleeves, ashamed of their weakness. Guards opened the doors at intervals, tossing in bread and tin cups of water. The women devoured both with desperate hunger, then sat back in silence, waiting for the cruelty that still hadn't come. By the time they reached the ports, exhaustion dulled the edges of panic. The sea stretched before them, endless and gray, ships looming like dark fortresses against the horizon. They shuffled up gangplanks under the watchful eyes of soldiers and were led below deck into cavernous holds fitted with hammocks. The smell of salt and oil filled their nostrils, mingling with the restless murmur of hundreds of prisoners. Then came the shock. Food. Not watery soup or stale crusts, but meat, potatoes, bread, even coffee. Real coffee. The women eyed the plates as though they were traps. Some refused at first, certain the generosity masked a crueler fate. Others ate with trembling hands, guilt stabbing with every bite. "They are fattening us before slaughter," one nurse whispered, staring at the butter that gleamed yellow against her bread. The Atlantic crossing was long, each wave hammering against the hull like a drumbeat of uncertainty. The women huddled in their hammocks at night, seasick and frightened, listening to American sailors laughing above deck, music drifting down through the vents. They could not reconcile the sound of jazz with the image of the monsters they had been taught to expect. Every kindness felt dangerous, every meal suspect, and yet, day by day, the truth pressed in with the rhythm of the sea. Whatever awaited them in America, it would not be the kind of captivity the Reich had promised. It might, in fact, be something far more disorienting. The first sight of America came not as a grand revelation, but as a blur of coastline breaking the horizon, a line of trees and cranes rising out of the mist. The women crowded the decks, clutching the rails, their eyes wide and hollow after weeks at sea. Some whispered prayers, others clenched their jaws in silence, bracing for whatever waited beyond the docks. The Reich had promised them chains, cages, perhaps even parades through jeering crowds. They half expected to be marched through the streets like beasts on display. Instead, when the ships docked, the Americans moved with brisk indifference, herding them into trucks with the same efficiency used to unload crates of cargo. No grand spectacle, no humiliation, just the rhythm of logistics, the war machine humming on without pause. The trucks rumbled inland, past landscapes that seemed impossibly vast. Fields stretched farther than the eye could follow, dotted with farmhouses painted bright against the dust. Billboards shouted strange slogans, smiling faces holding soap, cigarettes, Coca-Cola. To women who had grown used to bombed-out streets and ration cards, it felt like another planet. They watched through slats in silence, overwhelmed not by cruelty, but by abundance. When the trucks pulled into the camps, they braced again for the sting of punishment. Yet what awaited them was not barbed wire towers and stone walls, but neat rows of wooden barracks, built with almost military tidiness. The fences were there, yes, but they were modest. Chain-link topped with barbed wire, hardly the fortress-like prisons they had envisioned. Guards strolled the perimeters, rifles slung loosely over their shoulders, their expressions more bored than hostile. For the first time, the women wondered if captivity here would be less about violence and more about something subtler, more insidious. Inside the barracks, they found bunks made of clean wood, mattresses stuffed with cotton, blankets folded at the foot of each bed. Windows let in sunlight, there were stoves in the corners for warmth. It was not luxury, but it was orderly, humane, and utterly at odds with everything they had been led to believe. Some stood frozen, uncertain whether to sit, to lie down, to trust what they were seeing. One woman muttered under her breath, "This cannot be a prison. This is a camp for children." Another shot her a warning glance, as though even speaking such thoughts could be betrayal. The first meal was served in a canteen, the clang of tin trays echoing as food was ladled out. Bread, butter, vegetables, coffee so strong its aroma filled the room. The women stared at their portions, hesitant to touch them, waiting for the trick to reveal itself. But no trick came. Guards sat at their own tables, chatting idly, barely glancing at the prisoners. Their indifference was the strangest thing of all. That night, as they lay in bunks far cleaner than any billet they had known in Germany, the question gnawed at them with greater force than hunger ever had. If this was captivity, then what had the Reich been protecting them from? For the first time, doubt flickered. Small, dangerous cracks in a wall of ideology that had once seemed unbreakable. The morning began with the clang of metal against metal, the call for roll. The women shuffled from their bunks, some still clutching shawls around their shoulders, expecting another day of humiliation. The guards counted quickly, their voices flat, as though this were routine rather than conquest. Then, instead of a march to some yard or work detail, the prisoners were herded into a hall that smelled, impossibly, of food. Real food. The scent struck first. Coffee. Not the thin, bitter surrogate made from roasted barley or acorns that had passed for coffee in Germany since the war tightened its grip, but coffee with weight and richness, the kind that rose into the air like smoke from another world. The women froze, inhaling, their eyes darting between one another as if they were hallucinating. Some whispered prayers, others simply stared at the steaming mugs being set out in rows along wooden tables. Then came the bread. Not the dark, dense loaves that crumbled with grit and sawdust, but pale slices soft enough to yield under a finger's touch. On each tray sat small dishes of butter. Real butter, golden and thick, glistening as knives cut clean through it. The sight alone was almost indecent. In Germany, butter had become a memory. Families scraped tins for margarine, mothers stretched rations with lard or watery spreads. Butter belonged to another time, the time before hunger. The woman hesitated. This was the moment they had been warned about. Temptation, corruption, the enemy softening them with false kindness. They stared at the food as if it were poison. One nurse muttered bitterly, "They mock us with this." Another shook her head, hands trembling, whispering, "If it is a trick, then let me be tricked." When the order came to eat, silence fell except for the scrape of chairs. The first sip of coffee was almost violent. Bitter, hot, alive on the tongue, it filled the body with warmth that spread down the chest and into the stomach. A few women gasped at the taste, some with tears rising unbidden. The butter slid across the bread, melting slightly against the warm crust, leaving grease on fingers that trembled as they lifted the slice. They chewed slowly, reverently, as though afraid the meal might vanish if consumed too quickly. Then it began, small bursts of laughter, soft sighs, the sudden chatter of disbelief. They spoke of their last taste of real coffee, years ago in peacetime, when their fathers still read newspapers in quiet kitchens and mothers still baked on Sundays. They spoke of butter churned in farmhouses, spread thick across bread during summer harvests. For a few moments, the war receded, replaced by the memory of normal life they had thought forever lost. But with the joy came shame. Every swallow carried the weight of Germany's hunger. They imagined their families scraping at empty pots, children with hollow faces, mothers rationing crumbs. Eating hair behind fences was both a miracle and betrayal. One woman pushed her tray away untouched, muttering, "My family starves, and I sit here like a queen." Yet her eyes lingered on the butter, and when no one was watching, she pulled the tray back. The Americans said nothing. Guards leaned against the walls, indifferent, as though serving prisoners real food was not a strategy at all, merely procedure. But for the women, the damage was done. Years of indoctrination had promised cruelty. Instead, they were given coffee and butter. The simplicity of it was unbearable. That morning, in a hall filled with steam and the smell of roasting beans, the walls of belief began to collapse. No speech, no interrogation, no propaganda could have pierced so deeply. A single breakfast had done what no battlefield had achieved. It had made them question everything. The first breakfast lingered like a bruise, even as the days settled into rhythm. Roll call, work details, evenings in the barracks. The memory of butter melting on bread haunted them. Meals arrived with consistency the women could hardly fathom. Bowls of potatoes, vegetables, slices of meat, and always coffee, its steam curling upward as if mocking their restraint. What had once been luxuries at home now appeared before them daily, and with every bite came the weight of betrayal. They could not forget the faces of their families, hollowed by hunger in cities battered into rubble. They remembered mothers cutting rations into thin portions, children crying over empty bowls, neighbors whispering about soup made from wallpaper paste. The Reich had taught them that suffering was duty, that hunger was sacrifice for the fatherland. Yet here, behind the enemy's fences, they lived better than those who were free. The contradiction tore at them like shrapnel buried beneath the skin. Some refused to eat. They pushed trays away, lips pressed thin, choosing the pain of hunger over the shame of indulgence. A nurse who had spent the war tending the wounded in field hospitals declared loudly, "If my brother starves, I will starve." She lasted 3 days before trembling hands carried food back to her mouth. Others wept openly as they ate, salty tears dropping onto bread spread thick with butter. Survival became an act of guilt, each mouthful a confession they could not swallow quietly. Whispers filled the barracks at night. Was this mercy, or was it cruelty of a subtler kind? One woman insisted the Americans knew exactly what they were doing, that every sip of coffee, every generous portion was meant to break their spirit, to make them complicit in enjoying the enemy's world. Another argued that refusing food was madness, that survival itself was resistance. But no answer silenced the gnawing thought. What kind of prisoners lived more richly than their starving kin? Letters made it worse. News trickled in of Dresden burning, of families displaced, of shortages so dire that neighbors fought over scraps. The women read by candlelight, holding trembling pages, then set the letters aside and stared at the untouched butter on their trays. Some ate quickly, almost angrily, as though punishing themselves with every chew. Others hid food in handkerchiefs, stuffing crusts of bread into pockets they would never empty, an instinctive act to soothe guilt with the pretense of sharing. No guard ever struck them, no interrogator ever shouted. Instead, it was the food itself that cut deepest, turning into a weapon sharper than chains or rifles. It forced them to live while their families starved, to taste sweetness while their homeland drowned in smoke. The shame sat heavier in their stomachs than the meals themselves, a constant reminder that captivity in America carried a cost no fence could measure. Chapter 6. Letters Across the Ocean. The shame crept in slowly, hidden at first behind the shock of abundance. The first mornings of coffee and butter had felt like miracles, like a reprieve from death. But as the days stretched into weeks, the miracles soured. Every bite became heavier, every swallow sharper, because the women could not silence the thought of those left behind in Germany. Their mothers queued for hours for a few grams of margarine. Their children are waking in the night, stomachs clawing with hunger. Cities where kitchens stood in rubble and the only warmth came from burning furniture. And here they were, behind the fences of an enemy camp, eating better than they had in years. Some tried to resist. A nurse with hollow eyes refused her meals, her lips pressed in a hard line as she pushed the tray away. "If my family starves, she muttered. "I will starve with them." For 2 days she lived on water, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. On the third, when the smell of fried potatoes filled the hall, she broke. Tears streamed down, her face as she lifted the fork to her mouth, each chew a silent betrayal. Others were no stronger. They swore they would not touch the butter, yet by evening it was gone, melted across bread that they devoured in silence. There were women who wept while they ate, hiding their faces with their hands, ashamed of their own survival. One whispered through sobs, "Every mouthful takes food from my child's mouth." The guilt was irrational. She knew her eating in America did not strip food from anyone in Germany. But guilt is not bound by reason. It gnawed deeper than hunger ever had. At night in the barracks, the conversations grew sharp, brittle with accusation. Some hissed that the Americans had calculated this, that feeding them was a trick far crueler than starvation. "They want us to feel this shame," one woman spat, "so that every crumb tastes like betrayal." Others defended their need to live. "Would you die here just to prove loyalty? My death will not feed my family." But the arguments went in circles, because none of them could escape the paradox. They were prisoners who feasted while their homeland starved. Even letters home became daggers. Descriptions were censored, but the fragments that slipped through, "We are well fed, we have coffee," landed in ruined kitchens where families read them with hollow eyes. The women imagined those letters arriving, imagined their mothers' hands shaking, imagined the sting of envy and rage. No guard needed to shout, no whip or rifle was required. The food itself was the punishment, the unbearable kindness that turned survival into confession. They ate because they had to, because hunger was relentless, but each meal carved deeper into their conscience. Butter on bread had become more than nourishment. It was the taste of shame, and it lingered long after the plates were cleared. In the camps unfolded with a rhythm that unsettled the women more than violence ever could. They had expected bars and beatings, humiliation at every turn, but instead they were given routines, work details, chores, and hours of strange, disarming quiet. The mornings began with roll call in the pale light, guards moving down the lines with a kind of bored precision, rifles slung loose at their sides. Once counted, the women were released into a world that was supposed to be a prison, yet often felt like something else entirely. They worked in gardens, tilling American soil that seemed impossibly rich compared to the fields back home where even weeds had withered. They bent their backs over rows of beans and corn, the smell of earth clinging to their hands, and wondered how it was possible that their enemy gave them tools to cultivate food rather than starving them into obedience. Some were assigned to sew uniforms or mend blankets, sitting in long rows with needles flashing, the steady rhythm of thread filling the silence. Others scrubbed kitchens, peeled potatoes, or folded laundry for soldiers who treated the tasks as nothing remarkable. There was no cruelty in it, only a quiet insistence that work filled the hours. Then came the volunteers, American women in bright dresses who stepped through the gates as if they were entering a school. Not a prison. They brought books, knitting patterns, magazines with glossy photographs of smiling families, and advertisements for luxuries the German women could hardly imagine. Some offered lessons in English, teaching words slowly, pointing to objects, laughing gently when mistakes were made. The prisoners sat stiff at first, embarrassed by the strangeness of it, but slowly curiosity broke through. Words like sunshine, river, dance became secret treasures, whispered at night in the barracks as though learning the language itself was forbidden. And there was always music. Radios played in the guard posts and drifted across the camp on warm evenings. Swing, jazz, crooning voices that spoke of love and laughter instead of war. At night, the women lay in their bunks, listening through thin walls as Glenn Miller's brass or Bing Crosby's velvet tones cut into their dreams. Some covered their ears, muttering that this was corruption, seduction of the enemy's soul. but others closed their eyes and let the music carry them somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere untouched by bombs. It was captivity, but it did not feel like it. They were fenced in, yes, counted and contained, yet the days blurred into something closer to apprenticeship than imprisonment. They were not beaten into submission. They were shown another world and told to live in it. That, more than any weapon, unsettled them. For every day they remained, the line between captor and culture blurred, until they no longer knew if they were prisoners of war or unwilling students in the enemy's lesson about what life could be. It began with glances, quick and furtive, exchanged at the edges of routine. A guard who passed a cigarette through the fence, a prisoner who dared to accept it. At first the others pretended not to see, but the act rippled through the barracks like a stone thrown into still water. One gesture of kindness from the enemy could be dismissed as chance. Repeated again, it became something else, dangerous, intoxicating. Conversations started in halting phrases of broken English and fractured German, patched together with gestures and laughter that sounded too free for a prison. Some of the women, starved of normalcy, leaned into it, curious about the Americans who looked nothing like the monsters they had been warned about. They asked questions, learned words, and listened to jazz records carried under a soldier's arm. They began to laugh again, shyly at first, then more easily, and with each laugh a piece of the Reich's shadow slipped away. But not everyone welcomed the change. In the dim barracks, arguments erupted, sharp and bitter. "Traitors," hissed one woman as she caught her bunkmate humming to Glenn Miller. "Do you forget who you are? Do you forget our brothers dying?" The accused shrank, ashamed but unwilling to silence the tune that had lifted her spirits for the first time in years. Lines were drawn in whispers and stares. Those who accepted comfort, food, music were seen as weak. Those who resisted became guardians of a loyalty that no longer had a country to anchor it. The betrayals cut deeper when rumors spread of secret meetings. A nurse was seen walking a little too close with a guard during a work detail. Another returned from the fields with a chocolate bar hidden in her apron, a gift she would not admit receiving. Some women whispered that intimacy had bloomed between captor and captive, though whether it was affection, desperation, or survival was never clear. For the Loyalists, these rumors confirmed their worst fears, that captivity was not just destroying their bodies, but dissolving their very identity as German women. Yet the truth was more complicated. Some of those who accepted kindness did so with calculation, trading compliance for small luxuries, gathering bits of comfort to hoard against despair. Others admitted to themselves in secret that it felt good to be treated as something other than expendable. After years of being told their worth lay only in sacrifice, it was unsettling, even liberating, to be seen as simply human. The barracks became a battlefield of its own, one fought not with rifles but with suspicion and words. Every smile at a guard, every shared cigarette, every crumb of chocolate became an accusation. The women lived between hunger and temptation, loyalty and longing, each choice shadowed by betrayal. What had begun as captivity had turned into something stranger, a test of who they were when the Reich's grip loosened and survival demanded they face the enemy not as monsters, but as men. It was an ordinary morning until it wasn't. The women filed into the mess hall, the scrape of chairs and the clatter of trays echoing in the air, the smell of coffee thick and familiar now. Bread lay in baskets on the tables, butter in small dishes, catching the pale light that filtered through the windows. They sat down as they always did, weary but expectant, and then the guards entered with a stiffness that froze the room. One of them unfolded a sheet of paper and began to read. His English clipped and slow, as though the weight of the words pressed against his tongue. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. The silence that followed was unbearable. It felt like the air itself had stopped moving. A woman halfway through spreading butter on her bread let the knife slip from her fingers. Another stared into her coffee until the steam blurred her vision. Some refused to believe it. "No," one muttered fiercely, shaking her head. "It's allied lies, another trick." But the guards did not smirk or jeer. They only stood there, waiting, their faces solemn. That silence told the truth more than the words had. Tears began to fall. Some women wept openly, their sobs carrying through the hall, shoulders shaking as their hands gripped mugs too tightly. Others sat motionless, their faces blank, their thoughts too tangled to unravel. They had been told for years that Germany was unbreakable, that sacrifice and loyalty would ensure victory, that the fatherland was eternal. And yet here they were, hearing of its collapse over trays of coffee and butter, tasting defeat in the most ordinary of meals. The shame pressed hardest of all. They could not stop imagining their families in the ruins of Dresden, in the ashes of Berlin, scraping for crumbs while they, prisoners of the enemy, ate like this. Some pushed their plates away untouched, unable to swallow. Others ate quickly, guiltily, each bite laced with bitterness, as though finishing the meal might steady the ground that had fallen away beneath them. The room fractured. Relief seeped through some hearts. Relief that the bombing would stop, that their brothers and fathers might yet live. Others clenched their fists, muttering about betrayal, about surrender being worse than death. And still others said nothing at all, caught between despair and a strange, shameful sense of survival. The guards resumed their routines as though nothing had changed, refilling mugs, clearing trays, indifferent to the storm that raged inside their prisoners. That morning, every sip of coffee carried the taste of an ending. Every spread of butter on bread felt like treason. The war had ended not with a gunshot, but with breakfast. For many of the women, it was that meal, not the news itself, that marked the true collapse of everything they had once believed. When the ships finally carried them eastward again, the women leaned against the rails, staring out at the grey sea, each mile pulling them closer to what they once called home. But the Germany they returned to was not the country they had left. It was rubble. Smoke still lingered in the air, clinging to the ruins of cities where entire streets had been flattened. Children with hollow cheeks wandered barefoot through debris, their hands outstretched for scraps. Mothers queued for hours with ration cards that bought almost nothing. Hunger clung to the land like a second skin. The women left the trains with bodies that betrayed them. Their cheeks were fuller, their eyes less sunken, their clothes intact. They did not look like survivors of defeat, and for that they were judged. Neighbors whispered as they passed. "Prisoners," they said with envy, sharpened into bitterness. Prisoners who ate while we starved. In kitchens where broth was stretched with weeds and bark, the very idea of butter on bread seemed obscene. The women quickly learned silence. They folded their memories away, careful never to speak of coffee or butter, not in homes where bellies growled, not in streets where soot still coated the air. Still, silence could not erase memory. Late at night, when the wind rattled broken shutters, some of them closed their eyes and recalled the taste of coffee, rich, bitter, alive on the tongue. They remembered butter softening under warm bread, the glisten of it catching the light. These recollections were both comfort and torment, reminders of mornings when, though they were prisoners, they had been treated as if they mattered. That knowledge was dangerous. It contradicted everything they had been taught, everything they had sacrificed. As years passed and Germany rebuilt itself from ashes, those memories faded into something stranger. For some women, they became shameful secrets, never spoken, buried beneath decades of silence. For others, they lingered as cherished ghosts. In quiet moments with children or grandchildren, a few dared to confess. Not about battles, not about ideology, but about the mornings in America when they sat behind fences and tasted dignity in food. They explained that it was not the abundance alone that had shocked them, but the way it had been given, without cruelty, without scorn, as though even enemies deserved to eat. That realization haunted them the most. They had braced for chains, for humiliation, for pain, and instead captivity had offered something else entirely, a glimpse of life stripped of propaganda, a life where survival did not demand shame. In the end, their legacy was not in battles fought or victories lost, but in the paradox they carried with them until death. That sometimes prison had felt more human than freedom, and that the true taste of liberation had been carried in a mug of coffee and a slab of butter on bread.